The wise fear the Lord and shun evil, but a fool is hot-headed and yet feels secure.
Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly.
Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city.
A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back.
You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment." But I say to you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire.
Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
It's one of the shortest commandments, only 4 words, and it seems pretty simple and straightforward, right? You shall not murder. Even with the way Jesus showed that this command goes deep into our hearts, it might seem like there's not much else to say. And indeed, when it comes to remembering what this command covers in general, that might be true. This command is short, and the Children's Catechism explanation is equally brief. What does the 6th commandment teach you? Not to take anyone's life unjustly, and not to sin when I am angry. Yet there is definitely more that can be said. As the opening verses hopefully demonstrate, this command targets sin that lies deep in all our hearts, and we need to hear it frequently, from the toddler who may be playing with toys on the floor right now, to the adult who seems to have their temper in complete control. This command is still a challenge to all of us. So, we are going to begin in the way that we have begun with all the other commandments. What does this command tell us about God? We might be tempted to think that this command doesn't really tell us much about God at all, since it is about murder of our fellow human beings, not God. Yet it actually does tell us about God, even while it protects the lives of people. But in order to get to that, we need to start with a basic question. Why is the taking of human life wrong? There is no command for animals. A lion killing and eating a gazelle doesn't break God's command. Even a lion killing a fellow lion does not. A human eating a cow or a chicken isn't morally wrong. So, what is it about human life that makes it worthy of one of the 10 commandments? God answers that for us himself in Genesis 9:6. At this point, it is right after the flood, and Noah and his family are about to repopulate the earth, so God is giving Noah and his family instructions. He gives them the same creation mandate that he gave to Adam and Eve. He gives them dominion over the earth like he gave to Adam and Eve. And then he says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." There you have it. Why is the unjust taking of human life so important that it requires a commandment? Because, unlike lions, cows, trees, or other living beings, humans alone are made in God's image and likeness. Now, this is not the lesson to go into detail about what the image of God is in mankind, but it does show us that God chose to impart his image to us, which gives every human being a fundamental dignity and worth that far surpasses anything else in creation. No other created being, even angels, bears the image of God. And a strike at a human life is a strike at God himself. This should impact how we look at and treat everyone with whom we come into contact. They are not just an animal, they are an image of God. They are not just someone operating a vehicle or a social media profile that we can't look in the eye. They are an image of God. That person that you can't stand at work, that celebrity or politician who drives you nuts, that person on social media that just posted something that you think is unforgivably foolish. They bear God's image and have worth and dignity that we cannot just ignore. And this commandment wrote that, quite literally, in stone. Yet, there's some more detail we need to think about with this commandment. God used a Hebrew word that we translate murder, but has a much wider meaning than we think about when we use the word murder. It's the Hebrew word ratsah, which is for taking human life in a number of different ways. Of course, it covers intentional, pre-planned murder, what we normally think of as murder. It also covers intentional but not pre-planned murder. In our legal system, we would call this voluntary manslaughter. You didn't plan it, but in the heat of the moment, you did intend to kill that other person. Ratsah covers reckless killing, which we would call involuntary manslaughter. For example, a teenager driving recklessly and accidentally killing a person walking down the street. Yet ratsah goes even further. It covers someone who causes another's death by being negligent or careless with safety. For example, Deuteronomy 22:8 gives a law for building a house, and you had to put a railing around the roof. If you did not and someone accidentally fell off, you were guilty of murder because you could have reasonably prevented it. And ratsah even covers accidental deaths. One example given in Deuteronomy 10 is if your axe head broke off while you were cutting wood and hit someone else, killing them. It was ratsah. Now, the law also treated accidents differently from the previous examples, but this word that the sixth commandment uses still takes even accidents very seriously. So in the sixth commandment, God uses a broad word that covers everything from intentional murder to accidental deaths. And we need to take that breadth into account. You see, when we consider that humans are made in the image of God and the breadth of the word that God uses, this commandment shows us that God takes human life seriously because he is the Lord of life. We are not. While the whole rest of creation is under our dominion, human life is not. God alone is the Lord of life. Now, all that detail in the Hebrew word wasn't just to show us what we can learn about God, but it also helps us to answer the next question we ask of the commandments. What is God's will for me in this command? And here, the Children's Catechism is again a helpful summary because it gives us two categories to think about: taking life unjustly and anger. In the first, the Westminster Shorter Catechism is also helpful in question 68 by giving us a little bit more detail. The sixth commandment requires us to preserve our own life and the life of others. Now, this, of course, would cover such crimes that we normally think of as murder, abortion, or euthanasia. But notice how the Catechism says, my own life. The sixth commandment tells us that suicide is a sin. It's not unforgivable, of course, for it too can be covered by the blood of Christ, but it is a sin. Most of you out there may agree, but we live in a society that teaches us to think that we are in control of our own lives, even to the point of ending them. There are 10 states, for example, with so-called death with dignity laws that legalize physician-assisted suicide. Our culture wants us to believe that we should be in control of our own lives, but we are not. We do not belong to ourselves. God is the Lord of life, even our own personal lives. Now, as we think about the fact that preserving our life and the life of others is God's will for us in this commandment, we need to remember that ratsah covers recklessness and negligence with life as well. That's why the Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 69, says that this command forbids the taking away of our own life or the life of our neighbor unjustly, or whatsoever tends thereunto. That last bit is a fancy way of telling us that we can break this commandment by reckless and negligent living. God takes human life and his exclusive role as the Lord of life so seriously that even recklessness or careless neglect is breaking it. Sins like reckless activities, neglect of our own health, neglecting the health of others when we can reasonably promote it, taking unnecessary risks, etc. Church family, this is why Grace Covenant has chosen to follow the CDC and Virginia health recommendations during the COVID pandemic. It is not just that God calls us to submit to the authorities he has placed over us when they are not opposing his commands, like we learned last week. But it is also because caring for the health of others when we reasonably can is obedience to this command. Now, at this point, questions about biblical exceptions to this command often come up. Are there any? Yes, there are, in a sense. The Westminster Larger Catechism reminds us in question 136 that we are not to take away life except in the case of public justice, lawful war, or necessary defense. It notes those cases because passages like Genesis 9:6, Romans 13:1-7 show us that God has granted lawful authorities his authority to use the sword, as Paul puts it. He is still the Lord of life, but as we learned last week, he administers his authority through human authorities. They can apply God's authority to enforce the protection of human life through penalties and just war. Even as individuals, there are laws in the Old Testament like Exodus 22, verses 2 and 3, that show God intends humans to have the right to defend themselves, even if it means having to kill in self-defense. Yet, I would not actually call these exceptions because underneath these instances is actually a profound respect for and cherishing of human life. Because of the value of human life, it is our duty to protect it, which means governments can protect it with just punishments and just war, and individuals can protect it by defending themselves. So these so-called exceptions are really places where the sixth commandment is itself at stake, not actually exceptions to it. All that is probably, for the most part, clear from "you shall not murder." But Jesus shows that this command goes so much deeper into our hearts. That's why the Children's Catechism includes "not to sin when I am angry" in its summary. As Jesus told us, anger in our hearts and outrage in our words are a violation of the sixth commandment. I like the way the Heidelberg Catechism summarizes Jesus' teaching. By forbidding murder, God teaches us that he hates the root of murder, envy, hatred, anger, vindictiveness. In God's sight, all such are murder. Many of us have murdered in our hearts. While driving and someone on the road does something that gets in our way, when our kids misbehave, when a politician crosses us again, when we see someone of another race and treat them differently just because of that, and any and all other hatred, envy, vindictiveness, or rage. Kids, if you've ever called someone an idiot or said, "I hate you," to your parents, that is murder in your heart. We may not have taken away someone's life or contributed to it by our negligence, but who of us does not daily violate the sixth commandment in our hearts and thoughts? Who among us does not belittle, insult, hate, or kill our neighbor by our thoughts, our words, our look, or gesture? Jesus and our opening verses show us that we break this command many times a day. Yet we still tend to think of anger as a respectable sin, don't we? We tend to think, well, I have a bad temper or angry thoughts, but at least I'm not doing X. But God does not see it that way. The New Testament takes anger very seriously, putting it up there with sins like drunkenness, sexual immorality, sorcery, and false worship. And Paul tells us that if our life is marked by it, like other sins he mentions, we will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. If our lives are marked by unchecked jealousy, anger, gossip, or enmity, it is just as much evidence that we are not really Christians as our life being marked by physical murder, false worship, or homosexuality. There is righteous anger, someone might respond, and you would be right. Paul tells us that in our anger, we should not sin. And of course, Jesus got angry sometimes. That means we need to think about what makes our anger sinful. John Calvin is very helpful here and gives us 3 ways our anger becomes sinful and therefore a violation of this commandment. It is directed at the wrong person, therefore a sin against them with it. It is out of proportion to the wrong we've received. Perhaps someone steps on our foot and we yell at them for 10 minutes about it. Or it is motivated by the wrong reasons. Instead of anger at the sin against God or others, we're angry because someone is keeping us from getting what we want. That last one, I think, is particularly convicting because it is idolatry that I think is at the root of most of our sinful anger. I once heard Tim Keller say that anger is idolatry of the moment, and I think he is right. Much of our anger is because that other person is keeping us from getting something that we think we must have, an idol, and we lash out at them to try to get it back. When I yell at my kids because they embarrass me in the grocery store, my anger comes from my idolatry of looking like a father who has it all together, and they are keeping me from that. When we get angry at someone for proving us wrong or challenging a sin in us, very likely at the root of that anger is an idolatry of perfection or control. We want to be in control or perfect, and they just took that away from us. Anger can be righteous, but we need to ask ourselves if we are directing it at the right person, to the proper degree, and with the motivation of love for God and others. Now, I don't know about you, but often I feel that at least one of these is off with my anger, usually the last one. What about our good, though? Remember, that is one of the questions we ask of these commandments. Well, I think the regard for human life is probably pretty obvious. Caring for and preserving our own lives and the lives of others enriches us and our lives. That's good. And knowing that God is ultimately in control of that is freeing, because it means we can leave the questions of revenge and what people deserve in His hands and do not have the burden of making those choices ourselves. Yet it is also good for us to confess and let go of our anger. Think about it. Have you ever met an angry person who also enjoyed their life? I never have. Angry people are the most miserable people. So for God to command us not to sin when we are angry, which amounts to much less anger overall, He is actually commanding us to enjoy our life, to let go of slights, sins, mistakes, bad decisions of others, let Him handle it, and to go get a milkshake. Now, that's easier said than done, and we'll get to that in a moment, but just stop and think how delightful that is. Aren't days without anger and bitterness so much happier? It's a gift to have that weight of bitterness lifted off of us and put in the hands of God. Now that, of course, leads us to the last question that we have of these commandments. How do we fall short? And how does the gospel make us long to obey? I again need to wrap up this lesson, and I want to get to the gospel part, so let me just give you some questions to think about when it comes to falling short of this command. Do I have a list of people in my head that I wish would just disappear? Do I fantasize about telling people off or have imaginary arguments in my head? Am I constantly frustrated by people who are not theological enough, too theological, too conservative, or too liberal? Do the opening Proverbs describe me? Am I quick to say or think insults? Am I amazed by all the people who are out to get me? Those are just a few things to think about when it comes to the ways we may fall short of this commandment. I imagine you can think of many others if you take some time to dwell on it. But don't spend too long dwelling on it without turning again to Jesus. That's where we need to turn next. Because you see, Jesus and the gospel puts our anger in check. It does that in many ways, but I want to point out two specific ones. First, the gospel shows us that we are really no different than that person at whom we are so angry, except for perhaps that we have Jesus. It reminds us that we are made in God's image just like them. We are just as capable of the sin we see in them. And so if there is any difference between us, it is only by God's grace. They may do things that you can't stand, or they may say or believe things that seem ridiculous to you. But the gospel says, there, but for the grace of God, you would be. You would do that if you had had the past they had. You would think that if Jesus hadn't opened your eyes to the truth. Now, that's not excusing their sin, but it does take us down off our high horse of arrogance, humble us, and starts to change our rage into compassion for that other person who needs the gospel. And if our anger has an idolatry of the moment at its root, Jesus smashes that idol. If you're like me, there are probably certain things that you know set you off. Well, think about those things. What idol is being kept from you that's causing you to lash out in anger? If your self-worth comes from being a good parent, it's an idol. And then misbehaving kids will make you sinfully angry because they're standing between you and feeling like you're a good parent. Yet the gospel comes back and says, that's not where your worth comes from. Jesus has made you worthy with his worth. Nothing can change that. So relax. You don't desperately need to seek it for yourself. You already have it. You can just be concerned with your kids learning to follow after Christ. If what you value most is being in control, then when life spins out of control, anger and bitterness will start to take over. Yet Jesus says, look, you are not in control. You never were, and you're not supposed to be. But I am in control. And remember, you can trust me, for I died for you. Leave it in my hands. So think about what sets you off. Look at the idol that it is exposing, and then look to Jesus and ask, how does he smash that idol, being what I really need and want? And then pray for the Holy Spirit to remind you of that in the moment when you're about to lash out at your kids, at a politician, or at God himself, so that you can relax in the abundance of Jesus Christ instead of chasing after that idol in anger. You think about that. Amen.